I will finish the work Captain Titus started.
Boltgun is a 2023 shooter developed by Auroch Digital, and it is incredible. It's been a while since a game has made me feel like an utter death machine. I think the last time that happened was Doom Eternal back in 2020. But Boltgun absolutely delivers upon that promise of turning you into one of the Emperor's Angels of Death. Boltgun, honestly, has some excellent timing, as we're kind of going through a boomer shooter renaissance right now, or a gold rush if you want to be pessimistic about it. In the wake of Doom 2016, a legion of successors popped up. I mean, these days, you can't even sneeze on the front page of Steam without hitting a boomer shooter. Just off the top of my head, you have Dusk, Ion Fury, Head-On, Hedon, however you pronounce it, Project Warlock 1 and 2, Nightmare Reaper, Zorch, Ultra Kill, whatever game Night Dive Studios found behind their couch this week, Postal Brain Damage, Cultic, and Chex Quest HD? What the fuck? Now, I'm not bringing up these games because they're bad. Cultic is genuinely one of my favorite games ever, and you should play it right now. This isn't a joke. Pause the video, go buy Cultic right now, and play it. It's so good! The point is how common these games are. And with how common they are, it's a wonder it's taken so long for 40k to get one of its own. I mean, a boomer shooter is such a natural fit for the 40k universe that I'm kind of perplexed that it took like 7 years to get one. I mean, I guess Necromunda Hired Gun was kind of trying to do that, but yeah, it didn't work out so well. But Boltgun is everything I wanted a 40k boomer shooter to be. High-octane action, buckets of blood, and immaculate sound design. The game has seen universal acclaim by both fans and critics. PC Gamer even said that Boltgun was the first truly exceptional Warhammer 40,000 game since Dawn of War. A bold claim to be sure, but I'd be inclined to agree. Much like Dawn of War, Boltgun is a game that appeals to both 40k fans as well as casual fans of the genre it's in, and I'm sure that this game will be remembered and thought of fondly for years to come afterward. All in all, Boltgun is great! But you already knew that. Look, if you wanted to hear why Boltgun is fun, you could go to one of 100 other reviews on YouTube saying just that. Yeah, I'm sure everyone would love for me to show up incredibly late to the party, toss another Boltgun good on the gift pile, and then try to get drunk off of whatever dregs of alcohol are left on the ice cubes in the empty punch bowl. And I don't really want to do that. In this video, I really want to explore more why Boltgun works as well as it does, and really sort of dive into why 40k fans like it so much. This isn't really a review of Boltgun, this is more of an, I don't know, analysis? Ooh, isn't that a fancy word? Break out the vintage port, Charles. We're analyzing the Space Marine boomer shooter with the Fart Demons. A truly cerebral experience for the most cultured and wizened of individuals among us. So in Boltgun, you play as Malum Kaido of the Ultramarines, one of the chapter's Stern Guard veterans, and, much like Captain Titus, another example that the Ultramarines are not all Blueberry Boy Scouts. Now, I'm not bringing up Malum Kaido because I believe he's the greatest written Space Marine to ever grace the 40k setting. There's no moving emotional arc where Kaido learns the true meaning of what it takes to be a Space Marine. No, I'm bringing up Kaido because Auroch Digital got one very important thing right, and that is how it should feel to be a Space Marine. See, 40k is a setting ripe for FPS games, but it's had very few over its existence. We only got Darktide last year, and before that there was Necromunda Hired Gun, and Spacehawk Deathwing in 2016. Before that, you'd have to go back 13 years for 2003's truly awful Fire Warrior. Also, because I know some people are going to be pedants about it, yes, there was the original Spacehawk and Spacehawk Vengeance of the Blood Angels, but I don't consider those to really be FPS games, as they're more like tactical games with a first-person element. Moving on. Now, you may have noticed something there. In all those games, there's only a single one in which you can play as a Space Marine, and even then it's a Terminator. Why is that? I mean, they're the poster boys of the setting. Why are they so rare to see as the protagonists of action games? You'd figure with how popular they are, we'd see a deluge of Space Marine first-person shooters. We should be absolutely spoiled for choice of 40k games where you play through the eyes of a Technicolor armored space racist, purging heretics while saying stuff like, "Emperor says that's no good." But for some reason, we don't. Well, in my opinion, despite the popularity of Space Marines, they're actually quite difficult to make into first-person shooter protagonists. And this is due to something that I like to call the power armor problem. Alright, we're about to get analytical here. Strap in. So, in the language of most video games, power armor has a tendency to be very protective armor that has the trade-off of being big, bulky, and cumbersome. Power armor tends to have a speed trade-off, or at least a perceived speed trade-off, where movements are more exaggerated or made to look more big and impressive. Sometimes it'll be accompanied by a screen shaking effect or increased view bobbing. This all works to help sell the walking tank aesthetic that power armor offers. The ground is supposed to be shaking as you lay down the law, each footstep leaving a crater in the earth. So it would be somewhat dissonant to be walking around in power armor with the same level of agility that one would have without the armor. Sure, there are certainly exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, this is a fairly consistent rule across video games, which makes it very unfortunate that Space Marines exist to break this rule. I'm going to use the most annoying phrase a 40k player can say, but in the lore, Space Marines do not have the power armor problem. They are consistently described as having inhumanly fast reaction times and movement speeds. Space Marines are easily capable of running at a brisk 35 miles per hour without breaking a sweat, and they're capable of drawing their weapons fast enough to make West Flowers look slow. You ever worry you just made a reference that's a little too obscure? Space Marines aren't just heavily armored, they're fast too, which is pretty important with them all being post-human genetically altered super soldiers and all that. So already, I'm sure you can probably see the somewhat difficult design issue for Space Marines. I mean, how do you make something feel both heavy and fast? Those are practically complete opposites. If something's heavy, it's usually slow, and if it's fast, it's usually light. But somehow, Auroch Digital managed to pull it off. Their solution is simple, yet elegant, enough to make the past 4 minutes seem almost completely useless. They did nothing. Yeah, Auroch did absolutely nothing at all. And it works great! By leaning into the dissonant elements of Space Marines, Auroch managed to make a protagonist that feels tanky as well as agile. Like most boomer shooter protagonists, Kato moves fairly fast. This is nothing out of the ordinary. Despite his speed though, Kato still feels weighty as ever, because Auroch chose not to shy away from the typical tricks that power armor uses to convey its weight. The most they really went for was a slight screen shake and some pretty weighty footsteps, and that really doesn't help to slow down the breakneck speed you're moving at. Weapon animations are fairly quick too. Kato has a tendency to reload faster than you can blink, and if you lock onto an enemy with a chainsword, you practically grapple onto them. Even when sprinting, the biggest change that occurs is that your footsteps happen at a quicker pace. That's it. This isn't even mentioning the charge mechanic that this game has. Yeah, if you're sprinting forward and hit the F key, Kaido initiates a bull rush that knocks aside enemies and deals a pretty hefty amount of damage to them. Very frequently, this can be enough damage to kill an enemy, and every single time it happens, it's comedy gold. It's a pretty brilliant way to show that your protagonist, while still fast, is also a post-human wrecking ball covered in ceramite that has no qualms about throwing his weight around. All of these elements come together to create this perfect balance that I feel really helps to sell that you're in the boots of a Space Marine. You simultaneously feel like you're a walking tank, and also like you're capable of whipping shitties in the Forge Worlds parking lot without even being in a car. It's the best of both worlds. To say that 40k games have had a fairly consistent tone is an understatement. Since the original Dawn of War, the tone of every single 40k game has basically been the same.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only oppression and ennui.
And I'm absolutely fine with that. In fact, I appreciate that 40k has had such a consistent tone across all its adaptations. The grim dark oppressiveness is absolutely essential to the 40k setting. I mean, it literally coined the term grim dark. I think it's at least a little important. I think I'd have a stroke if I heard Space Marines going around delivering Joss Whedon dialogue.
He's right behind me, isn't he, brother?
Life is miserable in the 41st millennium. Guardsmen die by the millions to take half a mile of land. Citizens work grueling 20-hour shifts in a Forge World's manufactorums, and thousands are sacrificed every day to appease the dark gods of chaos. This type of hopelessness is a key element of 40k, and the setting wouldn't be the same without it. But there's another element of Warhammer that I think goes immensely underutilized, which is that 40k is fucking ridiculous. Warhammer is an absolutely insane setting. Almost all the art of Warhammer looks like a metal album. Hell, some of it was used as art for metal albums. If you're trying to sell 40k to someone, do you think they'll be swayed by you telling them how much it sucks to be a guardsman hiding in a trench trying not to shit yourself to death? Or do you think they're more likely to be sold on how Space Marines have guns that shoot bullets that explode like grenades inside of their targets? Or how one of the quickest ways to get anywhere in the setting is by taking a quick trip through hell? Or how the idea of chainsaw plus sword is such a ubiquitous concept that pretty much every faction has a chainsword in some way or another? Warhammer 40k is an over-the-top setting, and it is an incredibly important part of its identity. 40k has certainly received a lot of flack from fans about how silly its lore can be at times. Some of that flack is certainly well-deserved, but without all that silly lore, I mean, what do you even have left to the setting that makes it stand out? Seriously, take all that away, and what are you left with? A setting where the best I can hope for is to work a grueling job that I hate with terrible pay, and then go back to my apartment that's barely bigger than a closet? That isn't 40k, that's just real life. Now, if that job is in a factory that looks like a cathedral the size of a city, is overseen by a priest who is more machine than man, and has speakers installed into every single pillar to blast out prayers and hymns because they believe it makes the machines work more gooder, now we're talking. Boltgun is really the first game I'm aware of that takes advantage of the tonal absurdity of the 40k setting. Specifically, in the gameplay is where I think this shines the brightest. You chainsword enemies in half as gallons of blood spray out everywhere. When shot, enemies have a tendency to explode into chunky giblets, repainting the room red. It is absolutely ridiculous, and I cannot get across how much I love it. This tongue-in-cheek violence is something that's been missing from a lot of 40k games. Sure, Darktide lets you bisect and Nurgle cultists, and Space Marine had some pretty brutal takedown moves, but none of them feel like a celebration of excess like Boltgun does. Every time the devs had an opportunity to take something to 11, they took it. Imagine it like Spinal Tap's amps. Darktide and Space Marine are at a 10, and Boltgun wants to go further. Well, where do you go from 10? Certainly you could just keep 10 the top and make 10 louder.
These go to 11.
The best example of this is the titular Boltgun. Let's compare how the bolter functions in Space Marine versus in Boltgun. The bolter in Space Marine sounds good. It's big, industrial, and angry. It sounds more like a boom than a bang, as it's got a nice low rumble to it. You really get a sense that it's a thumpy, loud gun being fired. That being said, there's some clear restraint, as most enemies tend to just fall over and die when shot with the bolter. In my opinion, this is a pretty good and universe-accurate depiction of the bolter. Clearly a 10. Now let's take a look at Boltgun. The bolter in this sounds loud and angry. Every shot sends soda can-sized shells tumbling out the ejection port. The firing noise sounds like a big industrial machine that's powered by explosions, something that would rupture your eardrums if you were standing in the same room as it. Enemies shot by the bolter have a tendency to explode into gory giblets when they're killed, rather than just falling over. Now that's an 11. This design philosophy carries through to just about every weapon in the game. It helps to sell that your arsenal is made of nothing but the most deadly weapons in the galaxy, master crafted for this exact purpose. As I mentioned earlier, plenty other 40k games have some extreme levels of violence, but very few really lean into it as hard as Boltgun does. It's a game that goes, hell yeah, you are a genetically altered killing machine with pauldrons so big it took a Ford F-150's worth of metal to make them. Here is your weapon. Now let's go see how hard you can vibe check a heretic. The 40k fandom has latched on surprisingly hard to Boltgun. In the week following its release, there were a deluge of memes regarding the game, a bunch of fan art, and many people kit-bashing their own Malum Kaido miniatures. And that last one includes Rahu Kohli himself, the voice actor of Malum Kaido. Now, I can't say that Auroch intended for this to happen, but at the same time, I wouldn't really call it an accident. I think that one of the big appeals of Boltgun is that it uses a lot of what can only really be described as fan service. Now, fan service is a word that has more negative connotations than positive ones. When I say fan service, you might be picturing a very specific kind of fan service in your head. Trust me, Boltgun doesn't have anything like that in it. What I really mean is more stuff like Easter eggs, things that a hardcore fan is going to appreciate or find cool, that your average person won't really know about. Like how every one of the 6 main menu tracks is an instrumental cover of a D-Rock song. which was a band that made Warhammer-themed music during a weird time in the early 90s when Games Workshop actually had a record label. Or how if you sit idle for long enough, Kato takes a break and starts reading what I presume is the Codex Astartes, fitting for an Ultramarine. Or how a lot of the enemy sprites are very clearly based on actual tabletop models, which I find cool for two reasons. One, because it's models I'm familiar with and it's neat to point at something and go, oh look, I know that, but also because it kind of reminds me of how the original Doom made its enemy sprites. It also means that Sassy Nurgling is in the game, ladies and gentlemen! However, I think the most obvious example of fan service in this game is reserved for homage paid to another 40k game, Space Marine. With the exception of games that are part of a franchise, every 40k game more or less aspires to be its own thing. They try to keep their story, characters, and setting contained to itself. Boltgun, however, has taken a different approach. Rather than try and be 100% its own thing, Boltgun intentionally takes a lot of elements from Space Marine. The game explicitly name-drops significant characters from Space Marine, such as Warboss Grimskull, Inquisitor Drogon, and even Captain Titus in one of Kato's taunt lines.
I will finish the work Captain Titus started.
The entire game is also set on the same Forge world as Space Marine was, Graia. I mean, even the main plot device of Boltgun is just the exact same warp power source from Space Marine. I don't mean it's a similar but different warp power source, no, I mean it is literally the exact same object. But why do this? Why so explicitly tie yourself to a game that came out 12 years ago? Well, if you know one thing about 40k fans, it's that we really, really, really like Space Marine. For many 40k fans, it is considered to be the gold standard of 40k games, alongside like Dawn of War, or Dawn of War 2, depending on who you ask. It certainly isn't the most refined or perfect game out there, but it was damn good for what it was. And for years, it was dead in the water. Its sequel had been cancelled, THQ went belly up, and the plot details of the planned trilogy had been leaked online. That last one is somewhat the true death knell of the series. I mean, there's a reason we have the plot details of Half-Life 3 and not a released version of Half-Life 3. I mean, for a while, we didn't even know if Space Marine was even considered canon, which was debated for a whole mess of reasons I do not have the time to get into right now. So Boltgun makes sense as something trying to be a spiritual successor to Space Marine, especially since for years we thought it was dead. Now, all that I previously mentioned has mostly turned around. Space Marine 2 is coming next year, THQ is back but no longer in possession of the Warhammer license, and Titus is a canon character with his own miniature now, even though he has been demoted to a lieutenant. However, even after all that, Boltgun still works, and I think the key to that is that it doesn't rely on Space Marine for its appeal, and it's a good enough game in its own right. I mean, you take out all the cutscenes and the plot elements related to Space Marine, and you'd still have a pretty damn good game on your hands. And I think that's really important, as too much fan service can actually be detrimental to a game. Think about how many games or sequels that there are that are pretty bad and basically just rely on name recognition alone and being a thing you recognize to drive sales. Nobody wants another Marvel's Avengers or Aliens Colonial Marines, and Warhammer is by no means exempt from this practice. There is no shortage of 40k games that are banking solely on name recognition in order to get you to buy them, all trying to just be a thing you recognize with absolutely no substance. Fan service should be thought of as like cinnamon. Now, a little bit of cinnamon added to the right place in a dish can really enhance it, make it a lot better, give it a little spice, make it something tasty and pleasant that you enjoy. But if you're banking on nothing but cinnamon, well, nobody likes to eat a spoonful of cinnamon. I think it's safe to say that Boltgun has secured its spot as another gold standard 40k game, alongside games like Dawn of War, Mechanicus, and Space Marine. But that gold standard is becoming a category that has more and more entrants, and it's actually really great to see that 40k has had such an overwhelmingly good output as of recent. Consider the state of 40k games even a few years back. What good Warhammer games that there were often came about like once a year, and that's if you were lucky. And even then, those good games had to compete in a sea of awful 40k games like Storm of Vengeance, Regicide, and Eisenhorn Xenos. Even 40k's golden boy Dawn of War shit the bed with their truly awful third game. For a while, Warhammer used to be considered a death knell for a video game. The best most Warhammer games could hope for was to be bought by fans, receive middling reviews from critics, and then fade off into obscurity. They were like the Maroon 5 of licensed games. Except that Warhammer games actually used to be good. But as more games came out, the bad ones faded from memory. Like, seriously, who's thought of something like Freeblade in the past 5 years? Anyone? Anyone at all? Yeah, that's what I thought. The gold standard is starting to just become the standard for Warhammer games, and I'm okay with that. Rogue Trader has been a game I've been enjoying immensely, and a lot of people who are just into the CRPG space, but not Warhammer, had a lot of high hopes for it before it came out. In fact, I'd be willing to say that if it weren't for another game coming out this year, Rogue Trader probably would have been the biggest CRPG of 2023. 40k games have taken a sharp rise in quality. Even games that aren't the biggest thing in the world still see quite a bit of positive reception. Shoot As Blood and Teeth was a cute little project that got a pretty warm reception, and as much as I've ragged on Hired Gun in this video, there's still a lot of people who do really enjoy it. Games like these have a lot of potential to get new blood into the hobby, and that's always a good thing. Nobody wants to drink from stagnant water, and a community dies if it doesn't get more members. As 40k fans, we all know how good Dawn of War is, but consider how many people were just fans of RTS games and picked up the original Dawn of War not knowing what this whole Battle Mace 40 billion thing is, who are now deeply invested into the 40k setting. While I don't feel comfortable claiming that Dawn of War saved 40k, I would certainly be willing to say it helped to massively spread its popularity and influence. We can see this happening in real time with Warhammer Fantasy. Fantasy was killed off years ago by GW, but thanks to Total Warhammer 1, 2, and 3, we now have it coming back in the form of Warhammer The Old World. Good licensed media matters because if it weren't for games like these, I don't know if Warhammer would be as popular as it is today. I can say for certain that without the video games, my personal interest in 40k would have just remained at a surface level. I never would have read any of the great books like Brutal Cunnin, Eisenhorn, or my personal favorite, the Caiaphas Cain series. I also never would have started assembling an army and would have missed out on playing a tabletop game I've come to really enjoy. But it also means that I never would have gotten into incredibly stupid knockdown drag-out lore arguments with strangers on the internet, and that I also never would have had to deal with that one champion of Nurgle that resides in every hobby shop. So, swings and roundabouts, I suppose. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, maybe consider dropping a like or sharing it with a friend. It's my first video, so even just that would do a ton to help me out.